The snow came down in a hush that swallowed even the sound of their boots. Jack Mercer tugged his scarf tighter against the sting of the evening air, his gloved hand steady on the paper sack that held supper. Beside him, Emily skipped, her small boots vanishing in the drifts before reappearing, her laughter muted but bright, like the echo of a bell muffled by wool. She was 7, all spark and softness, the reason he kept walking this road night after night, no matter how long the day had been. The street was empty, their town already folding into itself for the winter night. Windows glowed amber, doors shut against the cold. Jack's breath rose in plumes, fading quickly into the darkness. He was thinking of the fire he would coax alive in their small stove, and of Emily's habit of curling close to it with her sketchbook, when she stopped so abruptly he nearly collided with her. "Daddy!" Her mitten pointed toward the roadside ditch. At first, he thought it was a bundle of trash, a forgotten sack left to stiffen in the frost. Then it moved, slowly, weakly. A dog, golden-furred beneath the snow, its sides heaving shallowly. Jack's chest tightened. He knew the dangers of strays, of sickness that could spread, of bites born from fear. But Emily was already kneeling, her small form bent over the animal, whispering in a voice so tender it made his throat ache. "It's okay. We'll help you. You're safe." Her words, so simple, carried a conviction he hadn't heard in himself for years. He crouched beside her, studying the animal. It was no mangy stray. Its coat, though matted with ice, was well kept, and around its neck hung a leather collar with a silver tag. The dog's paw was twisted at an odd angle, its whimper little more than breath in the cold. Jack said quietly, "We can't?" But then the dog lifted its head, meeting his eyes with a gaze so unguarded he found himself silenced. Hazel brown against gold brown, pain and trust mingled in a way he could not dismiss. Emily pressed her mitten against the dog's fur. "Please, Daddy. Just tonight." He exhaled, slow and rough. He had told himself, since her mother's passing, that he could not afford any more strays of any kind. Not dogs, not debts, not people wandering into their fragile balance. Yet here he was, scooping the dog into his arms, its weight awkward but not unbearable, Emily beaming as if she had pulled a star down from the sky. The walk home was slower. Snow pressed heavy against his boots, and the animal's shallow breaths warmed his jacket in faint bursts. Emily skipped less now, her hand on his coat to steady herself, her eyes never leaving the dog. Inside their cabin, the air smelled faintly of pine from the logs stacked against the wall. Jack laid the dog on an old quilt near the stove. Emily fetched one of her towels, the one she usually kept for drying her hair after a bath, and began patting the animal with great seriousness. Jack set the paper sack aside, watched her with a tightness in his chest. She cared in a way that cost her something, though she didn't yet know what. He fetched water from the kettle, pouring a little into the chipped mug that always stood on the counter. Kneeling, he set it near the dog. It lapped weakly, each motion an effort. Emily smiled through tears she hadn't let fall. "See? He's already better." Jack rubbed a hand over his face, weariness tugging at him. He wanted to tell her not to hope too much, not to let herself grow attached. But the words snagged, heavy and unspoken. He only nodded, pulling his coat from his shoulders and tucking it over the dog like a shield. Later, after supper had gone cold and Emily's head had begun to nod, he found her curled beside the retriever, one hand resting on its back as though anchoring it to this world. He gathered her gently, meaning to lift her to bed, but she stirred just enough to murmur, "Don't let him be alone." The plea slipped into him like a blade. He lowered her back, covering them both with a blanket, and for a long moment simply stood, watching them. The girl, her chest rising and falling in small, certain rhythms. The dog, breathing shallow but steady, and the quilt that joined them. He turned to the collar then, lifting it carefully. The tag gleamed when it caught the stove's light. 2 engraved letters, Tim. He frowned, running his thumb over the initials. They were etched with precision, expensive work. Whoever had owned this dog was no careless wanderer. Jack set the tag back down and stirred the fire, coaxing the flame higher. Sparks crackled, lighting the corners of the cabin. Shadows pressed against the windows, but inside was warmth. For the first time in years, The room held more than 2 beating hearts. He sat back, leaning against the wall, listening to the rhythm of breath and flame. He tried not to think of the risks, of the trouble that often followed the kind of wealth hinted at in that tag. Yet unease gnawed at him. When sleep crept over him at last, he thought he heard something faint beyond the walls. A low hum, the crunch of tires on snow, a pair of headlights pausing on the road outside. By the time he rose to peer through the curtain, the sound was gone, the night empty again. He stood there, watching the snowfall blur the dark, his hand gripping the fabric tighter than he meant. Someone would be looking for that dog. And when they came, he wondered not just what they would take, but what they might leave behind. He let the curtain fall, turned back to the fire. Emily sighed in her sleep, her fingers curled in the retriever's fur, and in that moment Jack understood that he was already too late. This animal, this stranger in need, had found its place in their fragile world. The fire popped, the storm pressed on, and Jack sat awake longer than he should have, listening to the quiet weight of change already at his door. The next morning broke pale and brittle, the kind of winter light that seemed to sharpen every edge of the world. Jack was stacking logs by the porch when he heard the low hum of an engine. He turned, and there it was, a black SUV gliding up the narrow road, too polished, too deliberate for their street of weathered homes and rusting trucks. The tires crunched over ice, the sound far too loud in the quiet morning. Emily pressed her face against the window from inside, her breath fogging the glass. She called softly, almost reverently, "Daddy, someone's here." The vehicle came to a stop, idling with the weight of something unwelcome. The door opened, and from it stepped a woman who did not belong to this place. She moved with a grace so practiced it seemed carved into her bones, dark hair pulled back in a sleek knot, a coat of wool and cashmere falling perfectly along her frame, boots polished even against the snow. For a moment she stood in the pale light, her breath curling, her gaze sweeping the yard like someone scanning a battlefield. Jack's jaw tightened. He knew the type, wealth carried like armor, presence sharp enough to keep others at bay. Yet she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes, a pale green that seemed almost too clear for this gray morning, fixed on the door. On what lay inside. "I'm looking for a dog," she said, her voice low but edged with command. "Golden retriever." Answers to Apollo. The name lingered in the air, too regal, too certain, and in that instant Jack knew. He gestured toward the cabin, his expression flat. Inside. Her steps were quick, almost breaking through her veneer of composure. When she entered the cabin, she faltered, not from the heat of the stove or the scent of pine and soup still lingering in the air, but from the sight before her. Emily was on the floor, her small hand resting on the retriever's paw as if guarding it. The dog lifted his head the moment the woman entered, a faint whine escaping him. His tail thumped weakly, recognition written in the arc of his movement. The woman dropped to her knees faster than her polished image suggested possible. "Apollo!" Her voice cracked once, just once, before she caught it again. Her hands hovered over his fur, not daring to touch until his muzzle pressed into her palm. Only then did she let herself exhale. Emily looked up at her with wide eyes, a little possessive, as though uncertain whether this stranger deserved the animal's trust. "We found him," she whispered. "He was cold." The woman's gaze softened in a way that surprised even herself. She nodded, brushing her thumb gently over Apollo's collar. "You saved him." Jack leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "If he's yours, you should take better care of him." Found him half frozen by the road. Her head snapped toward him, green eyes flashing, but she caught herself, smoothing her expression back into calm. "He must have slipped away during the storm. He's never done that before." "Dogs don't slip away for no reason," Jack said, his tone steady. "Especially not ones with collars like that." The remark landed sharper than he intended, yet she didn't flinch. Instead, she studied him with an unreadable expression, as though she were weighing not just his words but the man behind them. Emily broke the silence, looking between them. "We helped him. Daddy even gave him his coat." The woman's gaze shifted back to the dog, then to the little girl. For a flicker of a moment, the practiced mask on her face cracked. "Then I owe you more than I can repay." She reached into her coat, pulling out a slim leather wallet. Jack's voice cut in from, "No." The word hung heavy in the room. Emily tilted her head, watching her father carefully, sensing the undercurrent of tension. The woman straightened, slipping the wallet back without argument, though her lips pressed into a thin line. "You won't accept a reward for saving his life?" Jack shook his head. "She didn't do it for reward." His glance toward Emily made the message clear. The woman looked down at the girl again, studying her as though she were a puzzle she could not solve. Emily's cheeks flushed under the intensity of it, yet she didn't look away. Instead, she reached for her sketchbook lying near the stove, flipping it open to a drawing she had done the night before. A girl, a dog, and a tall figure standing beside them, holding hands. The woman's breath caught. She traced the image with her eyes, not her fingers, her throat tightening before she quickly closed the book. "You draw beautifully." Emily smiled faintly. "It's us." Something in the woman's composure faltered again, but she swallowed it, rising to her feet. Apollo whined, pressing his head against Emily's knee as though reluctant to follow. For the first time, the woman looked almost uncertain. She smoothed her coat, gathering her breath. "I should take him now. He needs proper care." Jack moved to open the door, the message clear. But when Apollo resisted, leaning once more toward Emily, the woman hesitated. The rejection, however small, cut deeper than she expected. She drew in a slow breath, her voice softer than before. "Perhaps I could visit when he's stronger. To thank you properly." Emily's face lit up, her eagerness unguarded. Jack's frown deepened, but he said nothing. The woman gave the girl one last lingering look, then met Jack's gaze. Whatever words passed between them in that silence were too quiet for Emily to hear, but the weight of them pressed heavy. She gathered Apollo into her arms with surprising gentleness and stepped out into the cold. The SUV door shut with a muted thud. From the porch, Jack watched as the vehicle pulled away, its tires scattering snow into pale clouds. Emily stood beside him, her breath quick with both sadness and wonder. "She was beautiful," she whispered. Jack didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the place where the SUV had disappeared down the road. He had no words for the unease coiled in his chest, or for the strange ache in his daughter's voice. Inside the SUV, the woman, Evelyn Marlowe, sat in silence, Apollo's head resting on her lap. She stroked his fur absently, but her mind lingered on the small cabin, the warmth of the fire, the sketchbook pages filled with unguarded dreams. Her life, built from steel and glass and distance, suddenly felt colder than she remembered. For the first time in years, she realized she was leaving something behind that mattered. When the city skyline rose faintly in the distance, she pressed her hand harder against Apollo's fur, but the warmth in her palm felt thin, as though it belonged somewhere else. And in the hush of that drive, Evelyn Marlowe understood that she would not be able to stay away for long. The snowstorm broke and passed, leaving behind a town muted under layers of white. Days slipped into a rhythm of silence and work, though it was a rhythm Evelyn Marlowe found herself disturbing more often than she had ever planned. The first visit had been justified, Apollo's paw was still healing, and she wanted to be certain he received proper care. But one visit became two, and then three, each excuse thinner than the last. Apollo seemed to know where he belonged, tugging at his leash whenever her driver slowed near the cabin. And Evelyn, though she would not have admitted it aloud, did not resist. Jack noticed, of course. He noticed the way the sleek black SUV began to appear with unsettling frequency, its polished edges like a shard of glass against the snowbound quiet. He noticed the way Emily lit up at the sight, racing to the door before he could even set aside his tools. And he noticed how Evelyn herself seemed to soften at the threshold, her posture still upright, her clothing immaculate, but her eyes carrying less of the steel he had seen that first morning. He told himself not to trust it. Yet when Apollo bounded toward Emily, tail wagging with a joy unclouded by hesitation, Jack's guard bent, if only slightly. The visits carved small rituals into their days. Evelyn brought things, though not the grand offerings of wealth one might expect. Instead, she brought a jar of honey from a farmer she had once done business with, or a bundle of winter apples. Once, a pair of mittens far too fine for Emily's small hands, though the girl wore them with pride until one was stained with flour and the other with charcoal. One afternoon, Emily pulled Evelyn into the kitchen, insisting she learn to make muffins. The countertops were dusted in flour, the air fragrant with sugar and spice, and Evelyn's movements were awkward, her fingers unused to such domestic clumsiness. Emily giggled at her attempts, her cheeks red with laughter, while Jack, watching from the doorway, felt something shift in the air. The billionaire CEO, who could sign contracts that moved millions, stood there uncertain, hands sticky with batter, letting a child guide her through the smallest of tasks. "Too much flour," Emily scolded, her voice filled with glee. "Perhaps I'm better suited to boardrooms," Evelyn replied dryly, but her lips curved at the corners, betraying amusement she hadn't allowed herself in years. Later, when the muffins emerged lopsided but golden, Emily pressed one into Evelyn's hands. Evelyn bit into it, winced faintly at the imbalance of sugar and salt, and then smiled, a real smile, one Jack had not seen before. Evenings drew them closer. Once, Emily dragged Evelyn into the yard to make snow angels. Evelyn hesitated, her immaculate coat a barrier she nearly refused to breach. But Emily insisted, tugging at her hand, and at last she lowered herself into the snow, lying flat on her back, the cold biting through fabric she had never meant to soil. Emily's laughter filled the air as she flapped her arms, creating the shape of wings. Evelyn copied her awkwardly, staring up at a sky dusted with faint stars. She hadn't done such a thing since she was a child. The thought ached in her chest. Inside, Jack mended one of Evelyn's gloves. She had left it behind by mistake, its clasp broken. He sat in his workshop, the cedar-scented air grounding him, and with quiet care, he repaired the clasp with a precision born not of wealth but of need. When he returned it to her, he said nothing of the effort, only placed it on the counter. She noticed, though, and for a moment her fingers lingered on the repaired seam, something unspoken passing between them. On another evening, when the wind howled fierce and sudden, Evelyn found herself stranded. The storm struck before her driver could return, and Jack, against his instincts, opened the door wider, bidding her to stay until it eased. The power flickered and went dark, leaving only the glow of the stove. They ate soup by firelight, bowls cradled in their hands, Apollo curled at their feet. Emily, heavy with sleep, leaned against Evelyn's side. At first Evelyn sat rigid, as if afraid the child's weight might undo her. But slowly she relaxed, her arm curving protectively around the girl. She stared into the fire, her expression unreadable, until her lips parted and words slipped out as if torn from her. "I stopped trusting people a long time ago." Jack looked at her from across the flames, his face shadowed. Emily stirred faintly but did not wake. Evelyn's voice softened, almost to herself. "A marriage turned cruel. Friends who wanted only what I could give. It corrodes you after a while, to know you're little more than a vault to most." Her gaze lowered to Emily's sleeping face. "But she doesn't see me that way." Jack's chest tightened. He wanted to offer comfort, but words had never been his weapon. Instead, he poked at the fire, coaxing the flame higher, letting the warmth fill the silence. Evelyn stroked Emily's hair with a gentleness that betrayed more than her voice had. When the storm finally relented, Evelyn lingered by the door, reluctant. "Thank you," she said softly. Jack only nodded, his eyes steady but unreadable. Yet something had shifted. The days after, her visits carried less pretense. She no longer came with excuses about Apollo's paw. Instead, she simply appeared, sometimes standing awkwardly at the threshold until Emily pulled her inside. She sat longer by the fire, asked questions about the sketches Emily drew, portraits of houses filled with laughter, of families whole. Jack observed quietly. His mistrust had not vanished, but it eroded piece by piece, replaced by a gnawing recognition. Evelyn Marlowe, for all her polish and wealth, was not untouchable. She was lonely. One evening, as dusk folded into night, Jack returned from splitting wood to see Emily perched on Evelyn's lap, showing her a half-finished drawing. Apollo lay at their feet, tail thumping. Evelyn's face was bent toward the page, her expression softened into something tender, almost maternal. The sight rooted Jack where he stood, his breath caught by the unexpected ache it stirred. Later, when Evelyn rose to leave, snow flurries swirling outside, she paused at the threshold. Her eyes met Jack's, and though no words passed between them, the silence carried weight. She stepped out into the cold, her coat whipping in the wind, and he found himself watching until the taillights vanished. That night, Jack sat long by the fire after Emily had gone to bed. He stared at the repaired glove still resting on the counter, at the empty chair Evelyn had left behind, and at the sketch Emily had drawn that evening, a family of 3, with a golden retriever at their side. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder what it might mean to let someone in. Evelyn, in the back seat of her SUV, leaned her head against the glass, watching the snow blur the trees. Apollo pressed close, his warmth a comfort. But her thoughts were not on her city apartment waiting high above empty streets. They lingered instead on the cabin, on firelight, on the quiet weight of a child's trust, and the way a man's silence seemed to say more than most people's words. And though she told herself she was only visiting, Evelyn knew that something within her had already crossed a threshold she could not so easily retreat from. Winter lingered long, stretching its silence over the valley, and in that silence Evelyn Marlowe found herself returning again and again to the little cabin tucked between the pines. What had begun as duty, checking on Apollo, repaying a kindness, had become something she could no longer name without feeling her heart betray her. She was too practiced at control, too long accustomed to keeping the world at a precise distance. Yet here, in the humblest of rooms, she had found herself lowering her guard. The town noticed. Whispers followed her when she stopped at the small grocer with Emily, when she lingered too long at the feed store beside Jack. Neighbors watched from porches, their faces unreadable, some curious, some disapproving. Jack felt the weight of those glances most. He had built his life carefully since loss, keeping himself and his daughter shielded from gossip and intrusion. Now eyes turned toward them, and he feared what those eyes might take. One evening, as Evelyn prepared to leave, he spoke the worry aloud. His voice was low, his back to the fire. "People talk." Evelyn's gaze did not waver. "Let them." But Jack shook his head. "It's not that simple. Emily doesn't deserve to be caught in the middle of their judgment." Her silence stretched. Finally she said, with a quietness that held more fragility than defiance, "Do you want me to stop coming?" The question pierced deeper than he expected. He opened his mouth, but the words caught. Emily, hearing only the tail end, rushed forward. "No," she cried, her small hands clutching Evelyn's coat. "Don't go away." The raw urgency in her daughter's voice unraveled the argument Jack had prepared. Evelyn's eyes softened, though her smile trembled. She touched Emily's cheek gently, whispering, "I don't want to go either." That night, when Evelyn had gone, Jack sat long by the fire, Emily asleep beside him. He realized his fear was not of gossip, but of how much they had already let her in. Days later, a letter arrived at Evelyn's office, delivered by a lawyer who had been slow to settle her late father's affairs. She read it in silence, sitting at her vast desk, the city skyline stretched beyond the glass. Her father's words were clumsy, regretful. He wrote of a daughter raised in cold expectation, of mistakes carved into her childhood, of hopes he had not voiced until too late. "If you ever find a family who chooses you, not your fortune," the letter ended, "do not let them go." The paper shook in her hands. She folded it carefully, as though afraid it might shatter, and without thought she found herself driving north. That evening she stood in Jack's cabin, the letter in her grasp. Her voice trembled as she read it aloud, each word a weight pressing harder on her chest. By the time she reached the end, tears blurred the ink. She had not wept in years, not in front of anyone. She turned slightly, ashamed. Jack crossed the room without a word. He did not offer platitudes. He did not tell her she was strong. He only set his hand over hers, steady and warm, grounding her. For Evelyn, that single gesture undid the years of distance she had carried like armor. It was the first time in memory that someone had touched her without expectation, without cost. After that night, their closeness was no longer something either could deny. It grew not in declarations but in gestures, the way Jack brushed snow from her shoulder before she stepped inside, The way Evelyn made tea in his kitchen as though it had always been her place to do so. Emily, quick to sense what adults hid, leaned into Evelyn's side more often, her laughter brighter when the woman was near. Apollo seemed to settle into the life of the cabin as though he had never belonged anywhere else. But Evelyn's world was not easily left behind. There were calls, meetings, demands waiting in the city. One afternoon, after a particularly tense conversation, she stood on the porch, her face shadowed with conflict. "I could go back," she murmured, almost to herself. "It would be easier. No questions. No risks." Jack watched her carefully. "Would it make you happy?" The question stunned her more than she expected. Happiness was not a word she had allowed herself in years. She looked at him, saw the steady weight of his gaze, and something in her steadied too. "No," she whispered. The days grew longer, snow beginning to soften around the edges of the fields. On one such day, Evelyn returned not in the black SUV, but on foot, Apollo trotting at her side. Jack was splitting wood, Emily gathering kindling. Evelyn's steps were slower, more uncertain than her usual stride. When she reached the porch, she paused, her breath clouding in the air, her hand trembling faintly where it rested on the railing. "I don't want to just visit anymore," she said at last. Her voice was stripped of its usual composure, leaving only truth. "I don't want to stand outside your door wondering if I'm welcome. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay." The world seemed to still in that moment. Jack studied her, the weight of years pressing through him. Loss, fear, the instinct to protect his daughter from anything that might shatter them. And yet, he saw the woman before him not as a risk, but as someone who had already chosen them long before she spoke the words. He didn't answer with speeches. Instead, he set down the axe, wiped his hands on his coat, and opened the door wider. Emily darted forward, flinging her arms around Evelyn with the unguarded joy of a child who knew when something true had finally been spoken aloud. Apollo barked, circling them, his tail a blur of gold. Evelyn bent, gathering Emily close, her face pressed into the girl's hair. When she lifted her gaze to Jack, her eyes shone not with power or polish, but with a tenderness she had thought lost to her forever. Jack stepped closer, his hand brushing hers as he closed the door behind them. It was a small touch, yet it carried more promise than words could. Evelyn's breath caught, and for once she let it. The fire crackled, filling the cabin with warmth. Emily nestled between them, Apollo sprawled across the rug, the weight of winter thinning beyond the windows. For a long time, no one spoke. There was no need. The silence was full of second chances, of wounds not erased but softened, of a family not born but found. And when Evelyn finally whispered, "Thank you for letting me in," Jack's answer was only a quiet nod, his hands still folded over hers. The snow outside melted drip by drip, and within the cabin, something thawed that would not freeze again. Some families were written in blood, others in choice. Theirs had been carved gently, in firelight and silence, by a dog who had limped into their lives and revealed what had always been waiting. And so it ends, in a home where love was found when least expected. If this story touched you, subscribe for more and share where you're listening from. Tell us what moment stayed with you most. Your voice keeps these stories alive.